Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Our topic today is infection, parasites, dysbiosis, and gut flora. These are common problems, and I think they can be approached with a similar fashion. I'm going to give you some ideas that are pretty controversial and different than the usual methods today for chronic imbalances of this type. All right, let's get into it. The difficulties of chronic infections, we're not talking about acute infections where a person has a very high fever and they're extremely in danger of dying. This happens rarely, and often it's overhyped and overinflated. If a person has a fever, it's up to 101, tends to not be a big deal. You can argue about higher temperatures. Even higher temperatures aren't always scary if you know what you're doing. And it also depends on the age of the patient. If it's an infant child, it's a little different than if it's an adult or a older child. But if it's an infant child, that's another story. So again, please don't take this as medical advice. This is just an explanation of what I've done and what I've seen in my life. So when you look at the idea of an infection, you've got an infection in your lungs, or you've got one in your sinuses, or in your eye, or in your ear. You maybe have an infection on your toe. You've got maybe some parasites. You've done a lab test and you find there are worms or some kind of small parasite or protozoan in your digestive tract. You've got dysbiosis. Maybe you've done a stool test or a urine test, which is even better, and you found that there's some dysbiosis, some dysregulated bacteria in your intestine. This is gut flora. So when those things happen, we have to ask ourselves fundamentally what is going on. And I think that the concept for me is one of what's called vitalism. And I know everybody hates vitalism, but I don't care. I'm a scientist, but I think there is a component to vitalism that actually makes sense. And I'd like to try to explain it. I think that vitalism gives us this concept that when a person has devitalized tissue, that fungus comes in, and that's another one, fungus, by the way, fungal growth on the skin. When fungus comes in, when infections come in, when bacteria comes in, when viruses come in, when dysbiosis happens or parasites come in, we have devitalized tissue that the environment is saying, oh, this needs to be cleaned up. It's partially dead, or in some cases mostly dead tissue that needs to be worked on, or it's devitalized tissue that's on its way to dying. So if you look at it that way, nature's doing us a favor by telling us where the tissue is not doing good. So we've got a limited amount of time before we can either lose that tissue and need an amputation, or get an infection that could become sepsis and go into our blood and kill us. Or, on the other hand, become revitalized and heal. And that's what I want to focus on. If someone has a chronic recurrent infection, or even a kind of an acute low-grade infection, like we see with college students, their sinuses, their lungs, their throat, their ears, all the COVID stuff, all the flu, all the colds, all the basic things that we see in the average ear, nose, and throat kind of presentation. Even in some cases, gum infections along the gum line in dentition. What I would like to suppose is that is life telling us that you're out of balance. And I know that sounds like shaming, and I really don't intend it that way. I don't intend it to be saying that you got sick and you're bad. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. What I'm really trying to get at here and really put a fine point on is that life really tells us and shows us, hey, what you thought was okay for a diet is not okay. If you thought that, well, certainly this amount of rice cakes is not too much. Certainly this small amount of almond crackers isn't too much. Certainly this small amount of white rice or brown rice or bread or pasta or lectins from potatoes or from any number of different plant foods, that generally seems to be the problem of producing mucus and producing areas of the tissue that are devitalized and that become deficient in B vitamins like B1, B3, B2, B12, and certainly in minerals like zinc and copper and other protective minerals like sulfur that protect us from infection. These various minerals and elements and vitamins help protect us from infection, and they get depleted by these foods. So I think we've become primed that it's okay to have a certain amount of foods. And then when we get sick, we say, well, I wasn't eating wrong. I ate a good diet, so I must need an antibiotic. And so I'm going to go to the doctor. I'm going to get an antibiotic, or I'm going to get an antifungal, or I'm going to get a drug. And I'm going to do that. And I'm going to keep eating what I've been eating. And what I would submit to you is, what if some crazy person told you that a bunch of people got well by detoxing and modifying their diet with an elimination diet, and that helped them get over infections really rapidly? Well, I'm that guy, and I've seen it before. And so I'd like to tell you that there are many people that have had chronic infections of their skin, of their sinuses, of all the different orifices that I talked about, vaginal, rectal, all kinds of stuff. They get these problems, and they immediately think, well, I was eating an okay diet. I wasn't eating too many carbs because everybody else was eating it. And I must say that the cognitive error that I made and that we make is we say, well, just because everybody else is eating this ratio of carbs and so am I, and I'm sick and they're not, that it couldn't be the food. Well, that's not really a good way of thinking, because there's a thing called biochemical individuality and genetics. And genetics don't say that you're predisposed to have this problem and you're going to be sick and there's nothing you can do about it. What genetics do is they give you a probability, and they say that you're more sensitive or less sensitive to this thing in life. And if you're like me and more sensitive to, say, carbohydrates or lectins, then you might find that you get more infections, and you can get rid of them by cleansing those things. So by doing an elimination diet, by detoxing from heavy metals, by detoxing from pesticides and molds and all kinds of stuff like that, and we're talking about by using things like activated charcoal, by using things like nebulized N-acetylcysteine or nebulized glutathione through a nebulizer. We're talking about the use of things like lemon juice and apple cider vinegar sometimes. We're talking about gargling with salt water or using a neti pot to wash out your nose. We're talking about going into a salt chamber and breathing salty air, like we have in Colorado. We have these salt places you can go into where you can just breathe salty air, and it really helps kill various infections. But what I don't want you to get stuck on, and what I got stuck on in the past, was trying to fight a war with the invading organism. So you get into this escalation of an arms race where you're using herbs and you're using drugs and you're using topical things to try to kill that invading organism that's infecting you, whether it's bacteria or fungus or virus or whatever it is. And I think that's a distraction, and it was for me. And when I could stop focusing on fighting the enemy and killing the enemy, whether it be from something herbal, like a really strong dose of, some kind of herb, like, oil of rosemary. Sometimes we use olive leaf extract. Sometimes we use oil of oregano. And these are nuclear level herbs that are really strong and powerful, and they can be too strong sometimes. They can strip the heck out of your healthy bacteria and healthy gut flora in your intestines. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use those ideas, but I don't want people to think that they always have to go right for an antibiotic, right for an antifungal, right for an antiviral drug. These are dangerous drugs, and they have many, many side effects, and they may not be necessary. So the idea is, if a person can detoxify from the lectins, if they can detoxify from the excess carbohydrates, if they can begin to purge themselves of those foods, and I'm not talking about, doing 1,000 enemas or vomiting. I'm talking about just simple methods of, eating some watermelon to cleanse out the intestine, eating more meat, eating more fat, eating more animal products, eating less carbohydrates and less lectins and less grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, less plant material, and maybe more fruit, even though it's a plant. I tend to sometimes find that it's a really good transition for people to use the Saladino carnivore method, which is carnivore plus fruit and honey. And I find that can work really well for people that are in a transition to get away from certain foods. They might live on that, or they might say that they use that as a transition. Again, I'm not a purist, and I think you know that. The idea is we want to say, what is causing the problem? And it's really well known. Decades ago, there were published research in the nutritional literature. You can go to the libraries. I did it 30 years ago, went to the libraries, and I found literature that showed that mucus producing foods were generally sugars and dairy. These were the things that were the most mucus producing foods, and those caused mucus production in mucous membranes. Now, normal mucus is supposed to be like your tears. Your saliva and your mucus in your digestive tract is supposed to be very much like your tears, very watery. Once it starts to get thick and mucousy, that comes from the different types of secretions, and I'm not going to go into the names of all those, different types of secretions of saliva that we can make in our body and in our mucous membranes. There are some real technical lectures we can go into on that. But when you start to reach a state of alarm where your body's responding to lectins and foreign proteins of dairy nature, like casein or gluten or other types of lectins, a person can really have irritation of their mucous membranes, and they start to have lower pH, which is more acidic. They start to have inflammation, and they start to have the production of mucus. And mucus is a great fuel. Mucopolysaccharide is a great fuel for invading organisms. So if you make more mucus than somebody else, then the next guy, your host, you're basically saying to the world, hey, come and infect me. If there's some bacteria out there, just land on my ear and just infect my ear and give me an ear infection. And I can tell you that when I've eaten foods like lots of grains or lots of corn or lots of milk, I will feel my ears get really full and swell. And if you look in there, and this is the same on my patients, if you look in there, you'll see a swelling of the mucous membranes, a narrowing of the lumen inside there, the tube. And you'll see that can contribute to sleep apnea, that can contribute to ear infections. It can contribute to sinus problems and sinusitis, airway problems and open mouth breathing children that are, breathing through their mouth, and that's just pretty poor perfusion. Not to mention that it impedes the development of the maxilla and the mandible and the teeth as the child's growing. So we really want to think about, why do we get infections? And it's not about fighting the infection. And there's been a kind of a media bias or a media twist that makes us tie together some things that shouldn't be tied together, which is, if your kid has an infection and if you care about your kid, you're going to put them on antibiotics because you want the best thing for your kid. Well, wait a minute. If I want the best thing for my kid, do I necessarily want to throw drugs at them right away if I know the root cause? So maybe sometimes it's worth thinking about, in the throes of a fever and a throat infection or an ear infection or a sinus infection, let's radically change the diet. And I've done this in hundreds of people, thousands of people over the last 30 years, and myself. And I've had amazing results, even while traveling in adverse conditions, that you can help get rid of infections very, very quickly by drastically changing your diet and getting rid of almost all carbohydrates, almost all lectins, almost all plant foods, and really biasing toward non-mucousy animal foods. And that means dairy is iffy. It's not clear whether dairy will be good for some people or bad for some people. I've had better luck with raw dairy than I have with any other kind of dairy, but that's just, me and my patient population. I could be wrong, but think about this idea and let me know what happens in the comments. Tell me what you think. I want to know, because I just don't think that infection and parasites and dysbiosis and fungus is that big monster when you understand what the root cause of tissue that's been devitalized and that's been degraded and has been deficient in nutrients or even had subluxation, which is our chiropractic theory about how altered peripheral nerves can cause some problems with local tissues. Not just numbness and tingling, but areas of infection, areas of chronic recurrent infection like shingles. Shingles is a really good example of a chiropractic type problem where there's a regional neurological effect. But I don't want to get distracted by neurology. I want to focus on metabolism and really say that these big bad things that we fight with ever escalating wars of an arms race really don't have to be addressed. You can just completely not address the fighting of the infection and the mold. You can just completely forget about fighting it and just steal its energy supply, steal the mucus production, steal its energy supply, starve it, basically starve the enemy. That goes for gut flora, dysbiosis in your intestine, and it goes for surface infections like infections on your skin. I want to end by saying that there is some real common problems with misidentification of a B1 or thiamine deficiency, which happens in vesicles of the skin and flakiness and things that look like infection. They look like fungal infection. They look like flaky skin. They look like, bacterial or fungal types of infection on the skin. And it's very important to know that sometimes that's a B vitamin deficiency. And B vitamin deficiencies can be driven very easily by carbohydrates, by grains, by alcohol, by white rice, by, refined breads and flours, pizza dough, bread dough, those kinds of things. So if a person really tries these things and cuts those foods you'll be amazed at how rapidly infections change. And if you've got a child or an adult in your family with chronic recurrent infections, parasites, or dysbiosis, instead of the arms race, think about this and tell me what you think, and tell me what happens when you try these things and you talk to your doctor about what you want to do. Thanks.